Family law is about people, not paperwork. Trusted by thousands of UK firms, Leap's legal software gives family lawyers a single, fully integrated platform to scale your practice, stay compliant, and deliver better client outcomes. Learn more at leap.co.uk.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.
Hello, welcome along to the latest Today's Family Lawyer podcast. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Sara, Lyons and Hannah Bradshaw, founders of Blue Sky, talking about the impact that maternity leave has on return to work, very specifically within the legal services sector, because I think that's your background, isn't it? But I guess a lot of what you talk about is as relevant to other businesses as it is the law. Great to have you both on. In the first instance, it's always useful to kind of get a bit of background to our guests. So Sara, I wonder if you might tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, what do you do?
Sure. So I used to be an employment lawyer, and I've had a kind of squiggly career, which we are seeing as more common in people's lives now, no longer jobs for life for 30, 40 years. I then taught at the College of Law for a number of years, and then I relocated to Cambridge, where I worked at Judge Business School and ran executive education, professional development programs for lawyers, and I launched a Women in Law leadership program. And that exposed me to coaching for the first time, and that's where I became interested in coaching, and in a room full of female lawyers listening to the transformative effect of coaching on their careers. I then worked at a coaching consultancy, and there I met Hannah, where we started to explore designing something tailored for the legal career.
Which leads rather neatly onto you, Hannah. Tell us about yourself.
So I also was an employment lawyer, so we had very similar backgrounds. We were actually at the same firm for a bit, but not at the same time. And I had both my children at a US law firm in London and became a coach through my own experience of going on maternity leave, coming back, experiencing all the challenges that, are still very much challenges, and we see women experience still going through their maternity leaves. I came back and all my clients had been given to other people and had to slowly kind of claw my work back, and then went on another maternity leave. And in the process of trying to get myself coaching, because I felt as though the career that I'd built up until that point had been derailed by maternity leave, and I wanted some kind of expertise to help me get it back on track, I came across the provider that we both worked at and decided actually I would like to become a coach. So once I became a coach, started coaching full time and met Sara, and we started to realize that lawyers do have really specific challenges when they go on maternity leave. So absolutely what we do could apply to other industries, and lots of women have challenges. But we were getting really specific feedback from lawyers, and we were seeing the same challenges come up over and over again that weren't being dealt with by kind of generic coaching, because most people doing it weren't lawyers and they didn't really appreciate what those challenges were. But it led us to create Blue Sky, which is really trying to tackle some of those unique challenges head on in a way that general coaching doesn't really do.
You've teed this up really neatly, because obviously we're going to talk about some of those very specific challenges. But before we get on to that, I read resumes and I read job posts and that kind of thing, and organizations talk about being equal opportunities employers. I mean, from what you're saying, this simply doesn't exist. This landscape that an employer might imagine to be equal opportunities is what, a false narrative? I mean, what do you kind of make of that as a challenge for a lot of industries?
Saying things like we're an equal opportunities employer is great, but we don't live in a gender neutral world. So that doesn't reflect the experience of women in the workplace across the board, legal sector or outside in other sectors. So we know about the motherhood penalty. We know about the effect on pension. We know about the effect on career and progression. We know about retention. All of those things are experienced by women in the workplace. So being an equal opportunities employer are just words that don't actually reflect the real experience of women.
I think also it's the partners who are giving the opportunities. So it doesn't really matter what the firm is saying if those individual partners aren't really making sure that they are being equal when they're giving opportunities out. And generally, they're not. Generally, they're giving opportunities to whichever associate or senior associate they think is going to make their life the easiest. And that's often not the woman who's just had a year out looking after a baby.
We veer into dangerous territory, wokeism, if we're not too careful, I think, with some of this stuff. But let me put this to you then, that you described, not living in a gender neutral world and, the motherhood penalty. Talk to me a little bit about what you would describe the motherhood penalty as.
The motherhood penalty is essentially the career penalty that women pay when they have children. So if you look at, for example, the gender pay gap, there is almost no gender pay gap between men and women up until the point when women have their first child. And at that point, there is a fatherhood bonus. So men tend to see an increase in their earnings and their career progression at the same time that the opposite happens for women. And that is an economic phenomenon. I appreciate there may well be people who believe that's a woke invention, but it's in fact not. There's plenty of research showing, that within the law, the highest risk time for women to leave their careers is after their second child. It's pretty obvious to anyone who works in a law firm that women's careers stall in many situations after they have children. And we know, in law, women's PQE continues running when they're on maternity leave. So it's pretty obvious to anyone that if you're a 10-year qualified lawyer who's had 3 children, you're kind of performing at 10 years with 7 years of legal experience. So clearly that is a penalty based on the fact that you have had children.
That sounds like one of the specific to law things that you talked about in the introduction, Hannah.
Yeah.
So if we get into what in particular the law is bad at when it comes to dealing with returning mothers, or indeed mothers who leave to go on maternity leave, what kind of things have you identified that are specific to law?
So other than that PQE issue that we mentioned, which is a big issue, there's lots of other things about the law that don't apply to other kinds of professional services or other similar careers. Lawyers are billing their time in 6-minute increments. That means, if you are a returning mum and you've got to leave to do the nursery pickup, or you've just got a less elastic day, the law isn't rewarding you for being more efficient and getting your work done in a quicker amount of time. You're billing less hours if you do that, so you're actually worth less to your law firm. Also, in other industries, you will have a line manager, whereas lots of lawyers don't have a line manager. They just work for different partners in their team. But it means that when they return from maternity leave, there's no one person whose role is kind of their pastoral care and looking after them when they get back and making sure they reintegrate. So for lots of women, that makes it, additionally challenging because they don't have that line manager figure when they return. The combination of all of those things, kind of billable hours, PQE, no line manager, just means that the whole environment is clearly not set up with women who have children in mind. And we're frequently coaching partners who end up being the first partner who's gone on maternity leave and discovered there's, nothing in the partnership deed about maternity leave and it's never occurred before. And technically, they're not entitled to any maternity pay whatsoever.
And you talked about your desire to coach around this, but you've actually got empirical evidence as well that demonstrates some of the challenges that we're talking about here, because you've recently released a new report around this very topic. Can you give us a bit of an insight into some of the key kind of takeaways from that report? Perhaps 1 or 2 things that didn't surprise you and 1 or 2 things that did.
I would say what didn't surprise us is that 78% of the women that we surveyed, so just under 300 women currently on our programme, 78% said that they've experienced the effect of the motherhood penalty in some way.
So a really similar figure was 77.8% of women said that they were concerned about the impact of maternity leave on their careers. Again, that doesn't particularly surprise me, but it's kind of sad that in 2026, the overwhelming majority of lawyers going on maternity leave are going concerned that it's going to negatively impact their careers. So that wasn't particularly surprising, but still.
I was going to say, I wouldn't have said that that's a statistic that I would consider to be unique to legal. I would imagine there's an awful lot of people might feel that way.
Yeah, I mean, it would be interesting to know how that compares across different industries for sure.
What about things that might have surprised you that came out of your research, that unexpected or unintended consequences?
One thing that struck me was when you think of ambitious, talented, very intelligent women who are practicing as lawyers, experts in some of the sectors they work in. When we asked them about whether they had a long-term strategy in relation to their career, only 31% at the beginning of the programme had any kind of strategy around, where their career is going. And we also then asked that question by the end of our programme. So, our aim is to show that our programme adds value and has real impact on people's lives. So that increased to 53.3% felt confident that they had a long-term strategy. So that increased by increase was by 71%. But that does surprise me, and it might surprise listeners, that not everyone has a long-term career strategy. They're just kind of surviving and taking it not day by day, but they're sometimes waiting for something to happen rather than making something happen.
And is there a geographic sort of split around that? I mean, I think my gut would suggest that if you were perhaps based in the city, something like that, that you might be more inclined to have a clear career plan and path, because you may well be in a firm that encourages that. Whereas if you're in the provinces, perhaps there's less of that career development opportunity.
So we work with lots of different kinds of firms. So we work with plenty of, US firms and London city firms, also Dublin firms and kind of more regional firms. And I would say no, there is no geographical split. There are plenty of overworked city lawyers who don't have time to think about their long-term career strategy, so they don't have one. And there are plenty of provincial lawyers who are extremely ambitious and they can see a path at their firm in a way that some of our city lawyers can't. And so they do have more of a strategy because their path is clearer for them.
What about the growing number of people for whom partnership is not the kind of be all and end all? I think, you go back to traditional view of law and it was really working your way up to become the partner ultimately. Whereas we know, and this is true across a whole range of industries, but very specifically in law as well, we know that this route to partner is no longer the kind of guiding light and be all and end all. Is that something, again, that you found through your research?
In previous years, we looked at ambition for partnership, and actually something that might surprise your listeners is that the overwhelming majority of women across their maternity transition were motivated by the prospect of becoming a partner. So 83% of our women by 9 months after they returned from maternity leave wanted to be partner. And I would imagine, I don't have data, but I would imagine the majority of the partners who were in their teams wouldn't have necessarily assumed that the figure would be so high. And when we do sessions with partners, they guess that figure is much, much lower. So absolutely not everyone we coach wants to be partner. And there are lots of other roles within a law firm, and that's not the be all and end all of anyone's legal career. But actually, I think, it's good for partners to know that the majority of women do actually still want to be partner.
Through your coaching, you work with women who are looking to go off on maternity or who are returning from maternity. But then are you also working with firms and trying to enlighten them in such a way that they really should be thinking about this, that it should be part of the firm's DNA to be thinking about, well, I've got a female team, there's a XYZ chance of that team going off on maternity at some point over the next few years. We need to have a plan in place to deal with and cope with that.
Yeah, 100%. So it's just one part of the jigsaw puzzle is to provide coaching for women going and returning from maternity leave. On its own, that's not enough, and that's not going to lead to any kind of cultural or systemic change. So the other things that we do, which we hope does lead to change and better practices to support women, is we offer webinars for managers who are supporting returners. So having key conversations at the right time and talking about career progression and what's expected of them and aligning expectations on both sides. We also share the data that we talked about today with partners so that they can understand where crunch points are in a woman's career when they come back from maternity leave, when they are less motivated, less engaged and exhausted, and making sure that there's not just one conversation when there's a crunch point, but there's an ongoing conversation as they transition back from maternity leave. And some of our firms actually want us as coaches to speak to line managers on a one-to-one level to actually help them with those conversations, because we know that some partners leave it to HR to have those awkward slightly, they see them as risky conversations, and we give them the confidence to realize that actually just be a nice manager, nice partner. Obviously ask them how they are, but don't shy away from conversations about their career, because that's what we know our women really, really want. They want to understand where they're going, how they're going to get there, who they need to support them.
I think I've alluded to it at the start of this conversation, but you talk about risky conversations there. I mean, again, is there evidence that does put people off, that this is a difficult conversation to have? You walk a bit of an HR tightrope as well if you're not too careful. And at a point in time where, there's a huge amount of litigation that goes on around this sort of thing, and it gets, portrayed in the press as well, that we don't have these conversations because actually they're too difficult.
Say hello to Moneypenny. We're you when you can't be. Answering calls and qualifying leads, booking appointments, updating your case management system. We handle it all just like you would, with brilliant people, AI, or both. Visit moneypenny.co.uk today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think lawyers are the ones who are the most afraid because they know what can go wrong.
They know what the outcome is, yeah.
Exactly. Most people plow ahead and they have no idea that they're about to be sued. But lawyers do know. And I think as a result, they tend to err on the side of saying nothing because they're kind of risk assessing the situation. And I do think that because Sara and I were both employment lawyers, it means that when we're helping firms, we're not just helping them from the perspective of our coaching and our data, but also from a lens of kind of employment risk. So when we're helping them to frame those conversations, we also have that in mind as well, in terms of making sure we're not exposing them to any kind of employment risk, because, we've seen all the data from the employment tribunals. There's massive backlogs, there's more and more claims, the law's about to change, and we're obviously want to protect our clients from getting sued in terms of, the advice that we're giving them as well.
What about scenarios and thinking about HR where people are requesting to work more flexibly, and this is very relevant obviously to returning mothers, isn't it, to have the option to work more flexibly?
Absolutely. And this is something that we discuss both in our group workshops and one-to-one coaching, when we know that women heading back who may have been full-time before having a child might want to consider going part-time, so requesting flexible work. And we know that currently there's consultation around the right to request flexible work, and also businesses having requirements, to real business requirements, to turn it down. So I think employers are going to have to kind of really be much clearer on why they're saying no. We know that many female lawyers do work full-time and they carry on working full-time after their children, but we do know there's nervousness around, will I be taken seriously? Will I still progress if I reduce down to, say, 4 days? We rarely see a practicing lawyer going down to 3 days.
And connected to that, post-COVID, the ability to work from home, and actually the sort of almost the kickback against that as well. I think as part of these consultations you mentioned, there's going to be the opportunity for businesses to respond and say, no, actually we want people back in the office 5 days a week. COVID created this bubble. Again, thinking about things like childcare and working flexibly, the working from home phenomenon has changed law firms massively. But do you see that change is permanent, or do you see that it could kind of revert, and what impact is that going to have on the issues that we've talked about today?
We've seen a bit of a split, I think. So there is some firms tend to be more kind of city type firms where that trend is absolutely reversing, and there is a real trend back to 4 or 5 days in the office, and that is a massive source of stress. There's a few firms where they've implemented that without much notice, and that's had real impact on people's childcare that has been based around what the previous policy had been. On the flip side of that, there are other firms that are really holding on to their kind of more flexible working with 2 or 3 days in the office and a bit more autonomy in terms of where you work. Those firms, I think, are seeing it as a competitive advantage and know that they will hire more women who leave the other firms, forcing them back into the office more. So I think there is a split, and I do think it will become a factor that people look at when they're looking to choose which firms they work at. So yeah, there seems to be a bit of a divide. I don't think the whole industry is going in one direction. But we collected some data on that last year. So we asked our participants if their firms were rolling back in terms of allowing them to work from home, and then whether they felt positively, negatively, or neutral about those changes. And I think about 60% of our women at that point said their firms were requiring them to come into the office more and were having more return to the office mandates. And of those women, so about 300 women across a full cross section of, different kinds of firms, all of the women who said that there were return to work mandates, all of them, over 70% said that they felt negatively about it, and the remainder said neutral. So all of them were either negative or neutral, and no one felt positively about it. I'm sure there are some women who do feel positively about it, even with very small children, but it clearly disproportionately impacts women with young children when firms are reintroducing return to the office mandates.
It's a time when the legal sector is, got a real race for talent, particularly across, family law or wills and probate and conveyancing. Surely something like flexible working from home is a recruitment tool, and we want to be encouraging this flexibility rather than discouraging it.
I was going to say there's also the additional element of visibility, how important visibility is for women when they're back from maternity leave. So we discuss that a lot on our programme, which is, yes, we know flexibility really helps with childcare responsibilities and logistics, which still unfortunately fall mainly on the women's shoulders. So visibility is important, but also flexibility is important. So it's balancing those two things. But if recruiters are phoning up somebody, headhunters, and saying, I've got a firm that will allow you to work wherever you want during the day, no need to go to the city, go to the office, commute 1 hour each end of the day, someone will take that phone call because it will be of interest. So I think firms will become alive to that when they're kind of scrabbling around and fighting each other for talent. But I know there are, leading firms in the city who are quite confident about saying, this is how we're going to work. We're going to go back to pre-COVID days, and you can work for us or not. It's your choice.
Is there anything in your research or anything in the work that you do with the people on your courses around the pressure to return to work? Because again, I'm very conscious I'm speaking as a male, but I understand that there is a real pressure to return to work, particularly for people who might be considered high flyers or particularly high earners from the fee earning point of view. What
we do see is that the vast majority of women in the UK take between 10 to 12 months off, but we do see the more senior a woman is, especially if they are a partner, they will take less. So we're looking at around 6 to 8 months. But we have, unless Hannah has any examples, I've never heard of anyone feeling pressure from their firm to come back. In fact, we hear the opposite. We hear partners saying things like, disconnect, turn your emails off, just don't worry about work for a year. They are actually very supportive on the pastoral side of allowing women to have the amount of time that they need, and there's no pressure on saying when you're coming back. So there's an assumption that most people will take around a year.
That doesn't seem to correlate then. If the firms are kind of saying, we're easy, come back when you're ready, but the more senior somebody is, the less time they seem to have off. That almost sounds as though it's like an internal pressure, a kind of a real desire to return, or an internal pressure to return.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. I think the pressure is internal. So the more responsibility you have, the more senior you are, the more pressure someone putting on themselves. And what we sometimes see is women over-promising, maybe underestimating the impact of, having a young baby and how they're going to feel, 6 months into their maternity leave. And at that point, they've told their firms they're going to take 6 months, and they then feel pressure to then take longer because their firms think they're coming back. But actually, I would say, I agree with Sarah. I've never seen any firm kind of proactively pressuring someone to cut their maternity leave short.
We're fast running out of time for the discussion. And I mean, look, we could probably talk about this for most of the day. I guess to kind of move towards a conclusion of the discussion at the least, what's the solution here? I mean, can women have it all? Are there practical issues regarding motherhood? And we've kind of talked about one or two of them today, which are surmountable or insurmountable. Through your coaching, how do you reconcile these challenges?
So, I mean, it's a well-known quote, but I'll just use it because I think it's a really good one. You can have it all, but you can't have it all at the same time. I think that might be Michelle Obama's quote, but don't hold me to that. And I talk a lot about firms needing to recognise women's potential rather than recognising what they can give you on day one back from maternity leave. And so it's nurturing talent and recognising that someone might not be or might not have the bandwidth to be going full steam ahead and be an equity partner within the next 6 weeks coming back from maternity leave. But their lives will change and everything is a phase, and raising a family, your kids don't always stay young, they grow up, and these women have got a lot to give, but not necessarily at that really tough period when they've got young children to look after. I would say for us, it's about speaking to firms about recognizing the talent, recognizing the potential, and stopping women from leaving law. So I think that's all part of the same conversation.
There are some business imperatives though, aren't there? Things like, we have to hit a certain number of billable hours. We have to achieve this. We have to achieve that. And that makes some of what you've talked about there quite difficult, because you've got a real conundrum in terms of supporting somebody back to work, but then making sure that they're doing what they need to be doing.
Well, there is one law firm, Bristow's, where they don't have billable hours and they also have 50% female equity. So I do think, yes, those things absolutely are part of what makes it so challenging for women in the legal profession who have young children. But actually, in the future, particularly with AI taking over lots of the kind of junior, really hour-intensive work, there may well be scope to move away from that model. And I think that will for sure be helpful for women in the legal profession.
And presumably through your work, you've seen good, bad, and the ugly. I guess as we kind of come to the conclusion of the podcast, perhaps you might share some examples of best practice where you've really seen firms succeed in both supporting mothers going off on maternity and then returning as well.
So one of our firms, it's a very simple concept, but it seems to be really valued and appreciated by women returning from maternity leave. The senior partner has a one-to-one with every returning woman to check in with her and ask her about kind of career plans, career aspirations, which makes people feel really kind of visible and appreciated by someone senior. So it's really dealing with that, you're coming back, you're lacking confidence, you've got a bit of imposter syndrome, you're wondering, is it for me, can I do this? And to have that kind of senior person who's really kind of giving up some time for you and might also kind of look out for opportunities for you, it is a really good thing. So that's something we encourage with our firms. Hannah, can you think of any other best practice we can share? We've seen firms allowing ramping up and ramping down in terms of targets on chargeable hours, which again does work, takes the pressure off people who might be feeling overwhelmed, and also allowing greater flexibility on where women work in the first year after maternity leave. Some of our firms allow greater flexibility on that.
I'm not sure that we will do the motherhood penalty justice over the course of 25 minutes, but I hope that through the course of the discussion, we've given a little bit of insight into some of the challenges here, some insight into some of the skills and opportunities that are out there for firms, and some thoughts around how firms can best accommodate their staff during these times as well. So I'm very, very grateful to you both for joining the podcast and for sharing your insight.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much.
The Today's Wills and Probate podcast is available on your preferred podcast provider. It's also on today's familylawyer.co.uk. My thanks to Sarah and to Hannah. Thank you as ever for listening, and we'll see you again soon.
You're listening to the Today's Family Lawyer podcast, the leading source of daily news and insight for family law practitioners in England and Wales. Sign up to our free weekly newsletter at todaysfamilylawyer.co.uk and subscribe to hear all the latest news and views from across the family law sector. You can also follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter.